Hey everyone, I'm Brandon Chu and welcome to the Black Box of Product Management. Today I am very privileged to be joined by a special guest, Craig Miller, the former CPO of Shopify and a company legend who spent the last 9 years of his career building the largest technology company in Canadian history. Craig was the first marketer at Shopify, started the Toronto office, and then became the company's CMO and eventually CPO. During his tenure, Shopify's valuation grew from just under 100 million to over 130 billion, and the team grew from 100 to over 10,000. So to suffice it to say, Craig has seen hyperscale and has been through quite a lot. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
So, I'd like to cover a bunch today. It's going to be a pretty open conversation. I'd love to touch on your childhood to early career, of course, Shopify, and also talk about what's next for you and some of the principles that you've developed throughout your life and career. But first, I actually wanted to start at LinkedIn, of all places. And because there you have the most vague experience listed at the start of your career. It's an 8-year period that is simply titled owner with no other context. So, Craig, what were you the owner of?
Yeah, funny. I completely forgot about that. I guess if we rewind back to like the late 90s, early 2000s, I started going to school at McGill. And, going to university cost a lot of money. My parents basically said, hey, go figure it out yourself. And so I had saved a little bit of money from my own stuff that I'd done before, but I randomly came into this world of affiliate marketing and SEO back when SEO, I don't think the acronym even existed, and affiliate marketing was super nascent. And I didn't even realize I was running my own business at first, to be honest. I would set up these GeoCities websites with a few affiliate links and stick the same words over and over again. And suddenly the search engines at the time would show my sites at the top and I'd get these checks in the mail. And it was the craziest experience. I'd be studying like crazy because it's a super hard degree. And I'd come home from school and I'd open up my mailbox and it'd be overflowing with checks from random companies selling the most random of things: magazine subscriptions, hockey jerseys, ink cartridges, like you name it. I kind of sold it online. And I didn't even realize it was a business until I had to file my taxes at the end of the first year. And it was it was surreal. But the thing was, like, I had very little business knowledge or sense or acumen. I just kind of discovered this unique ability that I had at the time. And it was almost a distraction from my actual studies. I was studying electrical engineering. I wanted to learn about circuits and build robots and, computers. That's what I thought I was going to do. But the strange thing is, over 4 years, I guess the reality is that actual kind of side hustle, I guess if you'll call it, became kind of the more meaningful thing I learned in university. And the actual electrical stuff, that all kind of went out my brain the moment I graduated. And so, yeah, I ran this business for years. I kept getting checks in the mail. Eventually, I sort of realized I couldn't scale it to the next level because I never worked anywhere. And I kind of felt that, as weird as it sounds, I wasn't ready to hire people when I had never been managed myself. And so I thought, hey, maybe I should go out and kind of discover how businesses work before I go back and kind of re-enter the entrepreneurial world.
Okay, so, you built this business, you're thinking about scaling, but then you realize you never really built a business or you built a business, but you haven't worked for a larger company or managed folks or whatnot. So where'd you end up next?
There's a site called Kijiji, which had just launched in Canada. And they were looking for someone to be a developer and a business analyst. And I had no idea what a business analyst was, but I figured I could be a developer. And so I sent in my resume, and then I was like, what is this Kijiji thing? Went to their site. It was some rinky-dink, bizarre-looking website. Like, it was just very strange. And at the top, it said, we're having a community get-together at a bar called Saint-Sulpice in Montreal. And if you know Montreal well, you know Saint-Sulpice because it's got the best patio in the city. And so I thought, what the hell? I'll go to this community get-together and see what's going on. So I went there and was about to leave because nothing was going on. There was no community get together. And eventually I saw two guys huddled in the corner with a sign above them that said Kijiji. So I walked over, introduced myself and said, hey, is this, where are all the people? And this sort of sheepishly admitted, hey, the site just launched, but like, hey, it's great you're here. Like, what do you think of the site? And I was like, I've never used the site. I was just applying for a job. And they said, oh shit, okay. Well, and so then we ended up talking about the job, and that was my interview with 2/3 of the team. The next week I moved to Toronto, or next week I interviewed in Toronto, and the week after that I moved to Toronto. And so, yeah, I started there as a developer and business analyst. Business analyst I discovered was someone that put stuff in Excel, which was pretty easy to do. And developer, they wanted me to build some stuff for them. And the team at the time, there were 3 people. It was a group of 3 people within eBay that were kind of responsible for this in Canada. And then there's a team in San Jose, about 10 people that actually wrote the software. And so my job was to write some of the software in Canada and also be the business analyst. And then relatively quickly, they said, hey, instead of being a developer and business analyst, that thing you did kind of at university on the side to just make some money? How about you do that for Kijiji? And so, all right.
That's funny.
And so, yeah, I focused on marketing for the first, I want to say 3 or 4 years. Took the site from basically no traffic to about, I want to say 10 million Canadians use the site each month, which at the time was about 50% of online Canadians. Eventually ran the support team, ran the analytics team, ended up kind of running a little bit of everything. And probably the one that I liked the most was the product team. And the product team initially was, hey, me having an idea and then writing the code myself. So I kind of did the full stack from, what to do to actually doing the work. And then eventually I worked with the team that was in San Jose that actually, there were more seasoned developers. And I would kind of write the specs and tell them, hey, here's what I'd love for you to kind of build and add next.
You sort of just glossed over, but you ended up running marketing there. Like, you're an electrical engineer. How did you end up running marketing? Did you ever feel imposter syndrome along the way? What do you even think marketing is fundamentally?
Yeah, of course, the irony is, after Kijiji, again, I joined Shopify, and again, I'm doing marketing. And in all cases, I keep telling people I'm not a marketer. I know nothing about marketing. I've never taken a course in marketing in my life. I've never read a book in marketing in my life. I am not a marketer. It was actually my first manager at Kijiji, who's now a very good friend, who rightly kind of identified something about me during my time there. And, she said, Craig, you're a problem solver. And I think that was the moment it kind of clicked for me, in that most startups, and again, Kijiji when I joined, Shopify when I joined, the problem that they had is someone had written some software, but no one was using it. And what's the point of having great software or great product if no one's using it? And so the startup problem is getting people to use it, in the vast majority of cases. And so that's the problem that I solved. And then, once people are using it, then it's actually switches over and becomes much more of a product problem, which is, where do you take the software? Because you can take it a million different ways. So I think I'm more of a problem solver. And in terms of marketing, I never really even thought of it as being marketing. I thought it was just more like a game where I've got a number every week that I try and make that number go up. And there's certain tactics that I know, like SEO and AdWords, and there's tricks and techniques and tools that you can use and figure out. And you just try and find a way to make those numbers go up each week.
Got it. So that brings us then to Shopify, and this could be a series of 20 episodes, but I think in your 9 years there, you saw a lot of versions of Shopify. You saw a lot of different evolutions of its culture. So why don't you kind of quickly take us through how you met the founders and joined the company?
I had got an email from a recruiter named Doug on LinkedIn, of all places, saying, hey, what do you think about Shopify? I thought he was talking about Spotify. I had no idea what was going on at the time. It was, Shopify was a very small company. I think it had raised its Series A. And
as a side note for listeners, that is how I often measured how big Shopify was becoming. The amount of times that people would call it Spotify,
Yeah.
and it'd probably be like 90% of the time when I started, they would call it Spotify. Like even interviews with Shopify, and
Yeah.
now it's like very rare that it happens. But
Yeah. I actually remember. I remember telling people I was going to Jaded Pixel Technology because it just sounded simpler, and that was actually the formal corporate name for Shopify. Shopify was the product, Jaded Pixel was the company. Um, and yeah, I got this interview, this note from Doug. I talked to him, and eventually, Doug's a fairly persuasive person. He got me to go to Ottawa to meet with the team. And to be honest, my thought process at the time was worst case scenario, I can see my parents who lived in Ottawa, and they, Shopify paid for a free flight. And I met the team, and I was really like, it was a very young team and very optimistic. And I just loved the energy of the office. Everyone felt like, the product was right. The people like loved this company inside and out. Toby and Harley, I spent a bunch of time with them, and I just thought they were just the most like fantastic humans. I mean, completely different. Toby was super cerebral. Harley was bouncing off the walls with energy, and I loved the people. And I thought, hey, and then when I went home and I did a little bit more research, I realized that the product was good, just no one was using it. And the reason no one was using it is because you couldn't find it. Like if you went on Google and searched for like sell online, online store creator, shopping cart software, it was nowhere to be found. And so I thought, shit, this sounds fairly easy. The problem was at the time they wanted me to move to Ottawa, and so I've ultimately said no to the job. To which a couple of weeks later, Harley calls me up and said, "Okay, maybe we can make this Toronto thing work." And yeah, the rest ended up being history.
But for listeners, Craig wrote a post of how that went down. So basically, when he said no, he wrote Toby and Harley a note with some great advice from all the things that he had learned about basically how to get Shopify more noticed, and it's a really great read. So for readers, I'll link it in the comments.
Yeah, so I ended up initially it was spend a lot of time in Ottawa and then come back and work from my side, my spare bedroom. And so I did that for maybe 2 months, and then I got the ability to have a small office and to hire someone. And so I brought in Bruno, who I had worked with at Kijiji. I had hired him to do marketing, and he was just amazing. And then we set up the small office in a co-working space. And like, just to give you a sense of like how bad it was, like we were right next to the bathroom and the kitchen. And whenever someone used the microwave in the kitchen, like the internet stopped working. And this is like an era before Hangouts. Like I was trying to use Skype, but I was like literally the only person in the company, me and Bruno eventually, were the only ones that weren't there. Like the entire company was physical in person. Like everyone was in Ottawa. And I was just this random person trying to dial in, trying to connect, trying to understand what was going on. And it's funny, being slightly out of sight and slightly out of mind, I could just try and run experiments and do things very differently than had I been there. And I think, Shopify and all companies early on have to be very opinionated because you have no idea if your thing's going to work. So you need to have some strong opinion on like what you're going to do, why you're going to win, the best way to write software, whatever it is. Like you just need to have that strong opinion. And so there's a very opinionated culture in Shopify early on. And frankly, like I probably did a lot of things that probably would have gone against those opinions, but because I was able to do them, removed from the office in Ottawa, I had a lot more flexibility because no one really noticed what I was doing. And of course, once they're successful, it's a lot harder to argue with something versus early on when you're like, hey, I'm gonna, create a blog that's gonna like publish articles about e-commerce every day and this and that. Someone, I don't know if that feels right. Maybe you should do this other thing. I just did it, and then later on, dealt with the consequences.
Was it experiment for experiment's sake? Like you're trying to challenge your own assumption, or did you have an intuition actually that people did want
it? I think I've always recognized that like I'm not the smartest person, and so I'm going to have some opinions and thoughts and ideas, and I'm actually super excited when I learn that I'm wrong.
So why don't you talk about your famed BHAG? So trace, from where we are in Shopify's history to basically the IPO.
So when I joined the company, I think 2011, the end of the year number was, I'm going to double check this because there probably are some numbers online that can verify this, but I think we ended the year with about 15,000 customers. So 15,000 businesses use Shopify. And again, joining the team, my job was marketing, and marketing, I didn't quite know what it meant. And frankly, when I asked around, none of the execs really knew what it meant either. They were just told as they raised their Series B that they needed to have someone running marketing. And so once I got to know the business, I realized the business was basically like the money in the business, the revenue that it produced was a factor of how many people subscribe to the platform. So if I wanted to make this business go up and to the right, I just needed more people on the platform. And so I realized marketing is equal to growth. And so I just said to my team, that I was starting to assemble, hey, let's make that 15,000 customers. Let's double it. And then I said, and then let's double it again. And then let's double it again. And, once you do a few of those doubles, you get to a point where, hey, this company could actually go public. And at the time that sounded like laughable.
For American or global listeners, like Canada had a pretty big following in BlackBerry's, BlackBerry basically going under roughly so post the financial crisis and with the introduction of the iPhone. And there was sort of like a dark ages, I guess, in Canadian tech. So it was, it is a story of Shopify as well, which is that everyone is discounting the even possibility that something big could be built here.
I had this hunch that at least the early parts should be easy enough because it was good software. People just weren't aware of it. So I felt the first 1 or 2 years should probably be easy. And so you asked earlier about kind of the phases of Shopify. The first little while I was there, it was fairly easy work for me, which was get people that were looking for Shopify to find Shopify. And so that was just, show up for every sort of thing that people are looking for it. And any way that someone's thinking about e-commerce or selling on the internet, like Shopify should be the number one choice, and it should be there, and it should be number one, number two, number three. It should be the only thing people are talking about. And so once at some point you start saturating that, then it really becomes a question of how do you get people to start thinking about Shopify? And that was a real kind of transformation. And it wasn't like one day that happened. It was more of a gradual thing. But that became from like serving a market to creating a market, which is when we started like educating people that they too could be an entrepreneur. It's not that hard. This was accessible and available and easy and within their reach. And that was when we started investing in different types of content. We did podcasts back again in like 2015, which no one was doing, like no companies were doing podcasts at the time. We wrote books. You could buy our book on Amazon. We created all this content out there to try and encourage people to do that.
Build a business competition.
Those are kind of what's that? Yeah, build a business. Yeah, build a business competition. Another great example. And so I think those are my two real phases of like if I divide my time in Shopify, it would probably be, marketing was the first half, product was the second half. And in marketing, the first half was really just like show up when people are looking for you. And the second half was like make people look for you, which is a hell of a lot harder, but is also a hell of a lot more rewarding. Because eventually you have people that say, this company changed my life. Not only did you provide the tool, but you provided the education. Like you taught me that I could do this, which was super, super fulfilling for me.
One of my earliest memories of you, Craig, actually, that really stuck with me and kind of proved to me that you're onto something is when you described or were asked in our AMA sort of what is our market size? And and you answered it really eloquently, where you basically said, you made an analogy to Nike, which is a company that we really respect within the company. And you said, Nike was probably their early market was for athletes, but then they basically told everyone or showed everyone that if you have a body, you can be an athlete. So therefore their market is everyone. And you used that as a metaphor or analogy for Shopify. And it was that anyone with ambition can be an entrepreneur. And
Yeah.
who doesn't have some ambition in their life, no matter how small, right? And I think that that was always something really powerful for everyone in the company to understand sort of what also the product needed to do, which was to nurture a nucleus of ambition within a potential entrepreneur and show them, step by step, sort of like that it becomes more and more possible.
It's funny you mentioned that. I remember one of the thoughts that spurred that too. I remember going on Google Images and typing the word entrepreneur, and basically what showed up was like Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and it was like, frankly, it was like a lot of white tech people, and I was like, man, that word has escaped us. The idea of starting your own business now seems so unobtainable for most people, unless you happen to have like, a father that gets you into Harvard. And I remember talking to some people, and they kind of said, "Hey, the word entrepreneur is like, don't use it because it's too far gone." And I didn't like that. I like the challenge of saying, "Hey, that this is something that should be for everyone." And so I think, when I switch over and talk about product, that was really my big focus on product, was to like make Shopify much more approachable and usable by more people.
Actually,
The product
Craig,
that I encountered.
before you get into that,
Yep.
just because I kicked it off with asking about your BHAG, what was the BHAG?
I said, I said 2015, we should be able to do, and I said, hey, should be our big, hairy, audacious goal. We should be able to have an IPO, and the company should be worth $1 billion. And at the time, I just like, it was, I wrote BHAG, but it was frankly like a silly thing just to get people excited. But the reality was, in 2015, when we went public, we were valued at 2 times the BHAG. So even I, with my like crazy imagination saying, imagine this company would be worth $1 billion, I was off by a factor of 2. And of course, the idea of Shopify being worth $2 billion today is equally laughable.
And this is actually, just for listeners, this is exactly about the time that I joined. So I think I joined like 2 weeks after the IPO. And this is where you hadn't officially done it yet, but this is where you start to transition into more product leadership role. And also when the product management team at Shopify started to, first seed itself and then grow.
Yeah. So Shopify always had this weird, at least during my tenure, relationship with product. When I first joined, Toby basically showed me, he had like, I think it was 6 Post-it notes on his wall in a pyramid. And he said, that's the roadmap. I was like, okay, cool. It sounded good enough. And like, frankly, when I joined during those first formidable years for me, the entire company was working on this giant technology rewrite using some new framework they created called Batman. So frankly, like nothing was coming out for for the users anyways. It was all being kind of rewritten under the hood. So there wasn't really a lot of product stuff that was going on anyways, other than just the technology rewrite. But later on, once that had kind of got out, Shopify experimented with different forms of what product could be. They had someone that sort of ran product management, not product, so more the discipline of it for a brief while. They had some product managers.
Wait, for listeners, like when you say product, not product management, or vice versa, like what is the difference in your mind?
Maybe the best way to put it is like, at least it was my experience that Toby's love for the product was almost like a father's love for a child, or a parent's love. I can only speak as a father. And he really had strong opinions on it, and he really, really cared about it. And he did not want to give that up. And so at some point he needed some help with just kind of like management, like the cue of what's happening. But he still really wanted to call the shots on where he wanted to take things. And it was really only, sort of, I guess a little bit after you had joined, that he kind of gave me the reins and said, you take care of the product, as in figure out where this needs to go, not simply the execution of his kind of grand strategy. And I think that was a big step for him. But I think part of it was, the transition to becoming a public company CEO. It's very hard to be a CEO, and it's equally hard to be a CEO and do like, a whole bunch of other stuff. And Toby was very hands-on in all sorts of different aspects of the company. And so for me, this was him just giving me this huge vote of confidence, which I absolutely loved. But it wasn't out of nowhere. For years, he and I had always talked about the vision of the company, sort of how product could evolve. I had always bugged him by like sneaking in little things into Shopify here or there that he didn't, initially he wasn't too into, but then later on he kind of grew incredibly fond of. And so I think he had a lot of respect that like, for my thinking. And I think he also knew that I cared about it deeply. And so, yeah, he made that transition at that point. And then for me, the big question became, okay, where do we take this product, and who are the people that are going to take it there? And I think that was right around the time I was fortunate enough to interview you.
Wow. Yeah, I remember when you interviewed me. I think the thing that got you to like me was, and I really understand it now, was I was doing my own similar sort of, economic hacking by selling stuff on Amazon. And, what I would do is I would take bestsellers on Amazon.com and then arbitrage that into the Canadian Amazon domain, because there's always a lag, basically. Like if it's trending in the US, then there's some time period where you can arbitrage that and find the manufacturer and bring that listing to Canada and reap it. And I think I distinctly remember we had a good conversation, but I think that was the thing that you liked the most, because and then now I really understand, with your history.
Yeah. I believe you were the number one selfie stick seller on Amazon in Canada. And you and I both play poker. And I think interviewing is often, this sounds a little bit bizarre, but kind of like poker, where you're just kind of looking for tells, and you're looking for some insight or some sense that there's something unique and special about this person. And for me, I think that what your side thing really stood out. And, everyone that I ended up hiring over years always had different reasons. But I think it was always just kind of looking for something that just shows you kind of what gets them excited, what gets them ticking, and shows that they're kind of different than the average person. Because you didn't need to do that. If I remember correctly, you had a full-time job at a very good company. You just did this because there was something inside you that just wanted more. And I love that. I love that.
While we're talking about interviews, and really how you just described the kind of insight you're looking for in people you interview. What's your favorite question?
I actually don't have any, I don't have that one question that I ask people. I basically break down the interview into kind of three components. The first one is we go and talk about something in their past, and I'll look at their resume beforehand, and I'll find one line on the resume, and we'll talk about that one thing for 20 minutes. And it sometimes drives people nuts because, they've prepared their whole life story. They want to tell you about, when I was a kid, I did this and then I did that. I'm I don't care. It said here you improved conversion rate by 10%. Okay, so let's talk about that. And so we end up talking about that for just such a length. And then you start realizing, was it them that decided to do it, or was it their boss that told them to do it? What techniques, what tools did they use? Why did they do it? Well, how did that, did that last? It was a temporary, why did they think that was, you just go so deep on that. And you really get a good sense of the person on the details, not on the general things. And the general things just get so polished and rehearsed. And frankly, people end up getting interviewed by 5 different people. If they tell the same story 5 different times, it's super boring when we all compare notes. So oftentimes I'll be I know nothing about what they did in the last 5 companies, even what they did this company. I just know this one detail really, really well. And that's the thing that got me super excited. And so, yeah, I'll spend a lot of time on that. Then I'll spend a lot of time saying, what do we need to do with our product? And again, this ends up being kind of simple if they say I've never signed up or never used it, because then there goes the interview, because I have nothing to talk about. But I love to just kind of probe them and see where their thinking is, what they tried, what they think is good, what they think is bad, and just kind of go deep on that. And frankly, if you have an interview with me and you haven't done enough research to know the current state of things, if it's good, if it's not good, you should have a sense of what your world would look like. And so for me, that's really getting a sense of that. And then the last thing is just opening up for questions, because I feel the interview process is always kind of unidirectional. It feels like I'm in a position of power and I'm interviewing you, and like you desperately want this job, and I'm just like, it's me to give or not to give. And I really want to make sure that it's like a two-way street, because like if this is like Shopify was when I was there a very bizarre and unique culture, and I didn't want people joining the company just because like the stock was doing well. I wanted people to like join the company, and like I wanted them to feel like this is the right place for them, regardless of all the other stuff. And so I really wanted like them to make that decision.
So, Craig, there are very few people on Earth who have been in an exec role in product as a CPO of a company that has both reached this size, but then also been on that journey from when it was smaller. So, I want to touch on a few things. One, I want to talk more deeply about what product was and became at Shopify, and we can break that down to maybe like some high level views of what the craft is in your mind, and then also I'd love to go down to the really low level too, to some examples or memories you have of like really tough product decisions that you made during your tenure. And then also would love to touch on, from a personal standpoint, what it felt like to be an exec at a unicorn, now centacorn tech company, and what the demands of that are, because I think a lot of people would be really interested. So why don't we start with like, what was product management in your mind, the function, what did we end up doing, and then maybe some stories or examples would be great.
Yeah, so the product team by and large was responsible for the thing that all of our merchants spent their entire day in, what they log into first thing in the morning and what they end the day off. And so sort of the challenge of that was figuring out what things to build, what things not to build, in which order to do them in. And again, it sounds like I'm greatly trivializing it by putting it at that high level, but that's fundamentally what our group had to do. And I think the thing that was tricky is, to a certain degree, as a product manager, you don't really have any very tangible things to show at the end of the day. Engineers kind of write code, designers, have pixels as output, and product managers kind of shepherd the team and try and like make sure they actually do the thing and get the thing out there. And it's a bit of a nebulous thing, because you don't really have something to show at the end of the day, except for once it all comes together. Is it a world leading product? Is it something that accomplishes the goal and surpasses expectations, or does it not? And so I think for me, the challenge was always, can I find some people that are able to inspire the team, can figure out what the problem is to be solved, to build it in the right way, to get it out as fast as possible, to think of all the different ways in which it could be done, to make sure that people use it. The list goes on, and just finding those incredible people to do that. And at least in my case, my strange, I guess, source of incredible talent was often founders. And I think the reason and I'm speaking, ultimately my team were the directors of product in the company, the VPs of product in the company. And a lot of those people were used to making, very big decisions and leading very large teams. And the founders of companies that we either acquired or, had struggled in the past doing, at a previous company, those founders were often the right people to kind of lead us forward. And so that ended up being kind of the makeup of most of my team.
Yeah, that was actually a really amazing evolution of Shopify, where, I don't know the exact ratios today, but a high percentage of PMs at Shopify and those that still are and made it through to leadership levels, they were ex-founders. Like we joked, but it was totally true, that like our gold mine was finding failed founders, basically. And I'm in that bucket too. And it was just people that, had been through that experience, had to have the weight of everything on them at some point, and kind of had a chip on their shoulder too, to both prove themselves to themselves. And I think that ended up being an amazing source of talent. You talked, the way you answered that question about what it is that we ended up building, you immediately went to finding people. And, so I want to double click on that a little bit, because I think especially you were never the type to kind of write out a 10-page roadmap for 1,000 people to execute. You really did empower your leaders to come up with the product strategy. What would, like, talk us through your strategy, your people management strategy, your leadership strategy around like how you both managed, I assume Toby having very strong opinions and the board and your peers at the C level on what we're building, but then giving agency to your team. Like, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But I think from my experience, you did it incredibly, and I would love for you to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that was tricky. As a person, I am incredibly opinionated on building products. Going back to my early days when I actually was both the product manager as well as the developer that built it, as well as the designer, as well as basically everything. I had full control, and I could build, and I didn't have to, convince other people. I could just do what I wanted. And I think that's something that's always stuck with me. I have very strong opinions, but ultimately I know that I'm working with really smart people. I spend so much time hiring and trying to partner with really smart people that if I come in kind of being a dictator and saying, do it this way, do it that way, then I really don't get much out of anyone. And so I think for me, it was always important to kind of challenge people, try and make sure they're bringing their A game, but at the same time, recognize that I have biases. I'm not perfect. I have strong opinions, but that might be subjective. I might like green, others like blue, and one is not necessarily better than the other. And so for me, I always try to make sure that at least at the highest level, we were all aligned on the right goal. And then the execution ended up being kind of a little bit more up to them. And this, I think for me, started in the earliest phases when I started working as a individual contributor product manager, working with engineers, where I would literally tell them how to write the code. And it drove them absolutely bonkers. They're like, stop telling me how to do my job. Like I've been writing code for years, and I'd be saying, no, this is exactly how to implement the thing. And I realized like I was not going to get very far if I tell everyone how to do their job. And so for me, a lot of it ended up always becoming about scale. And I knew the best way to scale was to make sure that people were, at the high level, very connected. And, everyone was on the same page in terms of like the vision, the highest level aspects of the roadmap, but then giving people a lot of agency. And I think what that ended up doing is encouraging the right people to really step up and to just to shine. And I don't think you would have got that if you were just telling people build it exactly this way.
I think that that upon reflection, of the time I'd been here, was one of your superpowers, was that you gave people the space, but you never chose who would take it. So PMs would, and I'm not going to name them all, but in my mind, I think sure you have some in yours, of just like people that just stepped up, took that initiative, and recognized that it was a place that, or Shopify and the product team was a culture that wanted people to want to take risks and be leaders, but it has to come from within. And I think one thing you were amazing at was when those people did that, you really amplified them, right? And I think that was a very, like, I found that to be a very amazing environment to work in. But also, I can imagine from your perspective, it is difficult because you're getting pressure to ship. And so you want to give your team space. You want to let them fail. Like, what was your mental model for when you had to step in to make sure this exact thing was shipped versus, give air cover to your team so that they can continue to explore and potentially build the right or wrong thing? Like, how did you manage that tension?
I remember about 2 years ago, one of our mutual friends asked me what the hardest thing about being an exec was. And I reflected on it for maybe a minute or so. And then I told him, it was smiling, which sounds a little bit bizarre, I guess, even now as I say it out loud. But you'll be dealing with so many different pressures and struggles from teams, conflict, And when you enter that meeting, none of that should matter. You got to put on those, the blinders that horses do, and just kind of focus on the team and make sure they're doing what they do best. And it's insanely hard. We're all humans. Sometimes you wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Someone cuts you off and as you're driving, and it puts you in a bad mood or whatever. And I think you've got to somehow or other compartmentalize so many different things and be your best. And teams, as weird as it sounds, like really thrive off of your energy. And so I always, when I enter a room, I try and be positive. I try and show my excitement for the project they were working on. I make sure I connected with all the PMs. And, I think doing so kind of gave everyone a bit of, I don't know, a mental safe space that they could do their best work and not have to worry that someone was coming in and immediately judging them, that they felt pressured or anything. I am inherently a pretty quiet person, and I know that and also, I'm 6'5". I sometimes just look off into the distance and think about things, which is actually quite intimidating to a lot of people. Even as a kid, I knew people were intimidated by me. And so I've gone out of my way in life to try and, I don't know, de-intimidate-ify myself. I don't know if that's a word. But I really wanted to encourage and get the best out of everyone. And so, creating that environment, creating that culture was always super, super important. And it's tricky when, like you said, there's time frame constraints, and there's competing interests, and there's, I'm getting feedback from one person saying this team's failing, and that team's saying that's that other thing, and trying to enter that and try and make sure everyone's in a good spot and still pushing things forward. It's tricky, and frankly, it's also very lonely. As an exec, you really have very few people you can talk to. I remember one of my kind of unofficial jobs, or at least I tried to make it my job, was to be counsel for Toby, the CEO, because I knew, hey, if my job was hard and daunting and trying and lonely, I could only imagine how bad it would be for him. So most of my one-on-ones weren't very structured with me giving product updates. It was more, hey, let's just talk about how things are going.
Totally. Yeah, I think people have like the sort of utopian mental model of what it means to be like an exec. Like you're pontificating about strategy all day and staring at a window and saying like, this is where we'll go. And I think the reality is that's a constant background process for you, but more like it's 30-minute chunks. The first 30 minutes is like, you might have to let some people go that have been at the company for 5 years. The next 30 minutes is you're thinking about acquiring company X. The next 30 minutes is actually doing the board report and then the investor call. And then you have this random one-on-one with a PM that has been trying to get on your schedule for 6 months just to say hi and meet Craig Miller. And that's where you need that smile. Right. And I think like that's the reality, I think, of the job that is extremely taxing. And I think a lot of people don't recognize, the grind of that and how lonely it is. So.
It's I think it's a pretty well established fact that most execs end up lasting, on order of, I think it's plus or minus 6 months to 3 years. And I think, it's rare for people to stick around a company for a long period of time. It's also rare, I think, in my case, to have been at a company when it was so small and also so large. But again, I think the struggles are real. I often kind of mentally thought that I was like those people you'd see in the old black and white clips that were just spinning plates on, on those sticks, and they're just like, one's starting to wobble, you run over and you start spinning that one again, and one's starting to wobble. And that extended beyond product to the company. At some point, hey, if there's an issue with a team that has nothing to do with me, but somehow or other I find out about it, I'm going to try and go and help that. And it extends beyond the company to, like, the Shopify as a ecosystem. So if there's partners or stores that are struggling, I'm going to go try and help them. And it goes on to like the employees' personal lives, where, hey, if there's something going on there, I try and help. And it goes on to my own personal life, where sometimes I felt like, geez, I'm not really giving the proper attention I should be to my family. And it's hard because you're just, something's constantly failing. You're just chasing after it and trying to push some effort back in there, and then realizing, oh, as you put more effort into your family, then work starts to struggle. So you go back or run over there and then try and help there. And it feels like it's a losing game for a very long time.
Is that also how you, maybe that spinning, balancing the plates kind of mental model, is that how you kind of describe how scale was too? It's like you're doing 2 plates and then just kept, and by the end you're doing 30 plates. Like, how did your role, I think we're talking a lot about sort of towards the end of like, at maximum scale, but earlier on, say 2015, was it different than when you left?
So absolutely, the job changed drastically over time, but it's almost like I didn't notice because I was just, hey, I was that frog in boiling water. It was just getting hotter and hotter, and I wasn't I wasn't paying attention. And in retrospect, if someone told me today, hey, would you join a 10,000 person company as chief product officer? That sounds intimidating. Whereas, I joined a company of 70, and it just happened to be part of that transition, and that was fine.
Yeah. Wow. So let's go all the way down to the day-to-day, and like, are there any projects or features that launched over your time as CPO that you feel are great examples of the type of product management thinking we had, the inflection points for yourself of like learning how to do that job, or even anything that you think, like, even just go backwards from the most impactful things that you feel the team built during the time?
Yeah. So I as I mentioned before, I think Shopify as marketing kind of had two kind of chapters to it. I think our product had kind of 2 chapters to it as well. Chapter 1 of our product was, making Shopify a lot easier for people to use. And when I joined the company, it was primarily designed for people that kind of knew HTML or kind of liked Liquid. There were themes in the theme store, but really a strong selling point of it was this Liquid templating engine. And so for me, I was always pushing towards how do you make it as simple as possible. Like, I think we talked about kind of removing friction and barriers to entry. And those are the types of projects I was basically involved in for a long time. And those would be things like, hey, if you want to print shipping labels within Shopify, it's 2 clicks instead of having to go figure out how to like set up an account with UPS and integrate that somehow with Shopify. Like, it used to be copying and pasting API tokens and things like that. And so for me, I was always trying to make Shopify much more approachable to increase kind of the audience size for how big Shopify could be. And so I think that was kind of the first kind of broad chapter for it. And that one was always there, but sort of midway through my time was also, how do we think about Shopify much more broadly, about instead of simply being a website with shopping cart, how do we think about being this backend for business, about being the sort of brain of your business, the heart of your business that has information on your products, your orders, your customers. It has analytics that tie it all together, kind of regardless of where you end up selling. And at the time it was website with shopping cart, and I think the assumption is the website with shopping cart will stick around for a long time. But sales channels, and that's what we call these, kind of may come and go. And we wanted to build kind of this more robust backend that served whatever sales channel, and that was point of sale. So your retail store, your online store, could be selling on Facebook, could be selling on Instagram, could be selling kind of anywhere. And that was that transition that I and my team kind of worked on really diligently to make sure that Shopify is more than just a website with shopping cart, and it was actually this commerce platform. And that was a very tricky sort of thing to do. It was almost like changing the engines of a plane kind of mid-flight, because we had, at the time, 100,000 merchants, and it was suddenly, telling them, yeah, I know you kind of signed up for this website and shopping cart, but we're giving you this other thing called a commerce platform or a retail operating system, or pick your name that we were trying to come up with. And that was tricky to sort of to do it so that we were future proofing the company, but also not losing our short term customers.
You want to touch a little bit on kind of, you were just speaking to it, but that tension of like product management as a science where you're doing the feedback, the iterative loop, you're taking data, qualitative customer feedback, and you're continually iterating that product, versus these super high conviction types of bets where there was no data that anyone was going to give you to tell you that we should be a multi-channel platform, because it's one of those like, it's something that people don't know they want, versus know they need. So what was your mental model of like how to balance those things, or what the weighting of those types of initiatives should be?
Like, one of the big differences between junior product managers and senior product managers often ends up being, I don't know if the word is conviction or faith or frankly just like the ability to have a strong opinion. I would often find that junior product managers would probably say, I'm working on the following 5 things because, I did some framework, or I did some research that says this is what we should do. Whereas I think when you talk with the more senior product managers, they would say, this is what I'm doing. I know these are the right things. And hey, if I'm not right, that's kind of on me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think even through my experience, like, to grow in product management in leadership, you have to take risk.
Yeah.
And that includes personal risk in your career. Like, it's because the whole game of technology is hitting local maximas in decisions that have been made prior, and then doing the responsible thing around that iterative loop and continuing to grow. But there are local maximas to every initiative, right, or to every strategy at some time frame. So to continue to grow, to continue to bring new products to customers and solve problems that people didn't even know, like, you have to gamble, right?
Yeah.
You have to have a viewpoint of the world and say, like, this is my intuition. And you could probably, compile that into a bunch of different quantitative and qualitative reasons why you have that intuition. But ultimately, like, there's innumerable probabilities in your mind that you're putting through to say, like, this is probably going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
And then you need people to be able to trust you to give you the resources and the time to see that through. And you sort of earn that through maybe some of the simpler product management stuff you'd done earlier on, that, like, and I think, like, that's an interesting sort of arc of, I think, product management careers, as I've seen them. It's just like you need to accrue trust, because at some point you have to say, trust me.
Yeah.
And then it's pretty binary. Then it's like, if you have a lot of successions of like trust me's and they work out, then your intuition is worth investing more in. And that's really hard for people to hear, because people want checkboxes and and like level frameworks and all these types of things. But I really believe of all disciplines, product management, at least over decent time periods, is very meritocratic.
The PM might actually be one of the more junior people on the team in terms of titles. So they needed to assume authority, even though they didn't have any technical authority over the team. And so I think the team really needed to have just a huge amount of trust in that person. And I think that only comes one way. It's earned.
There was like a value missing in an automated email that I think that was driving you nuts, because everyone knew it. It was so simple to do, but because of just like the chaos of Shopify and people needing to like feel there's a prioritized roadmap and things like that, it just kept getting pushed. I don't remember exactly what it is. I don't know if you recall. This is probably one of a billion things that you did, but any like little things like that you felt were like, just interesting stories of how Shopify's product ended up the way it is.
I think you touched on in a indirect way kind of how I spent my time at Shopify in terms of product towards the end. And I would spend it on, I'll say broadly, 2 things. which is like very high level stuff and then very low level stuff. And the middle stuff, the stuff in between, that I actually was not really that good at. So high level stuff, like making sure we have the right teams, that they're pointing in the right direction, that they're able to be successful and they know what success looks like spend a lot of time doing that. And that would be in indirect ways, like organizing our internal conference to make sure that everyone internally knew what we were doing as a company. It would be spending a lot of time with, you mentioned we used to write letters to the board, but letters to the board were actually also shared internally. So this is my way of making sure everyone internally knew what the product team was doing and trying to align everyone. But then I would also spend a lot of time on like the lowest level things. And I probably drove the team absolutely nuts. So before any sort of project would be going out, there would be typically a final review with me. And, I would obsess over like the use of a comma in a sentence. And I did that because I really cared. And I really felt that like all the details matter so greatly. And oftentimes those would be the things that like would be kind of thrown and pushed to like the last minute decisions. And the one that drove me nuts, but it was always the last minute decision, was like, how are people going to know about this thing? How are people going to hear about this feature? How are they going to turn it on? Like, what was our rollout plan? Which was kind of relegated to like, the final details and like just make sure we dot our I's and cross our T's. And they always assumed that the bulk of the work was, building the damn thing. And frankly, at Shopify, I don't think we ever failed building anything. Like, we were not building rocket ships. Like at some point, once someone says we're going to build this thing, like we built it. But we would struggle with, how does a normal human being discover this thing and then, decide they want to turn it on? And again, I would drive people nuts by saying, like, don't just assume we're going to do a blog and an email about this feature and suddenly adoption is going to be through the roof. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of time on kind of those little details.
No, I totally remember that. And I have so much to say around this, which is like, one, at a high level, I think it was an important cultural aspect of that you injected into the product management culture, which is like, as a user, if you see something that's just off, you're going to make an assessment of the entire system as being sort of untrustworthy, right? Like, oh, there should be a comma or a period here, that's obvious, right? And it just seems like, oh, this thing's not really cared for the way that I care about my business in Shopify's merchants case. And so that, I think, was a really important thing, because PMs otherwise, like, they're, you talked about how they measure their own success, and they're thinking about shipping it on time, having a big impact, the high level metrics, all these types of things, where they're just not sweating the details that much, even though we know as users that it's those details that make the difference between great and good products. So I thought that was always a really helpful, just so like undertone of reminder to people that like, yeah, Craig's going to talk mostly about like, let's go here, market size wise or strategy or whatnot, but better make sure that period's there, kind of thing. Right? Yeah. So that was one. On your example about like how to frame value to users of what we built, and just so everyone knows, like, this is a perfect bridge between like sort of where you started in marketing and how a lot of that thinking made its way into product, which we had posters on the wall that said like, do things, tell people, which is like literally a reminder to people of like, no one cares about the algorithm. No one cares about how scalable or resilient the thing we built is. We have to tell people what it does. And another great example, I think, was when we launched Shopify Shipping. I remember this very specifically. Like, it was about to go out the door, and I think you stopped it. You stopped it because of exactly something like this, where what was happening with Shopify Shipping. So we would allow merchants to basically buy shipping labels from all the major carriers with one click. Super complicated infrastructure underneath to kind of route which carrier would go to, find the best price, and all these types of things. But we didn't do the most basic thing, which is show the merchant how much they're saving by using this thing. right? So in the order page, we'd say buy shipping label. And what we didn't show was we knew that data, like this shipping label market price is $15. But because you're in this huge shipping buying pool of Shopify shipping, it's only $13. So show the $2, right? You save $2 by doing this. Like I remember like you actually blocking a launch for that. And people were like not happy, obviously, because of that. But in retrospect, I know because I have several Shopify shops. Like that reminder keeps me using this product, right? It's a very, very important aspect, and it's the distillation of the value proposition in many ways.
Yeah.
To something that a merchant's using every single day. So
at one point we were shipping something, releasing it to the wild, basically the day or the moment the code was complete, or maybe 24 hours afterwards. And then eventually, we got a little bit smarter. We did some controlled A/B test rollouts and things like that. But ultimately, I actually started encouraging teams to say, hey, get to code complete and then take like a week or 2 weeks and just like get every last detail to be, as crisp and perfect and clear as possible. And the reason that we would do this again was just exactly as you pointed out, because I think people notice all these details and they might make an assumption of the broader product based on sort of one mistake here, one thing that's confusing there. And so all these details really mattered. And the example I always used, which I think everyone can relate to, is, on the original iPhone, there was no copying and pasting. Like I guarantee you there was some smart person inside Apple that, 2 weeks before the iPhone was going to launch, probably said, hey, you know what, I could probably sneak that in last minute. And I'm sure someone equally smart at Apple said, no, like if you do that, then it means you can't do all those other aspects of kind of last minute polish. And sure, it came out and there was no copying and pasting, and like, cool, that comes in a second version. But like there will always be more time to add more features. But if you're not careful, like the time that you allot to a project will just equal the number of features, and you keep throwing in more and more features to just kind of get there. And then you never really have that moment to kind of get your work to be, something you're really proud of. And sometimes there was this idea that like quality and speed were at a trade-off. I actually think that you could just do less and just do it of higher quality.
So, one thing, there's, again, so much that we can talk about. One thing I think people would love to hear is, when you took control of the product team, it was still pretty small, but by the time you had left, it was probably over 200 PMs or product folk in your organization and other organizations, actually. But talk about that as a whole arc. Like, how in your mind did the function of product management evolve as Shopify scaled, and like what were the inflection points in your mind and how things needed to change?
Yeah. So in the early stages, this sounds bizarre, but it was almost justifying our existence. Because there were so few product managers in the company, a lot of teams were not using product managers. And I felt that our sort of feedback loop should be, hey, if we're doing our job well, then people will try and pull product managers in. Like they'll say, oh, we need a product manager to run this, and they won't just be able to do it on their own. And I think we got there pretty quickly. But I was just so conscious that I didn't want to build the discipline of product management for the sake of doing so. I wanted to do it because the company would be better off for having that discipline in there. And so we started ramping up the team over time. Part of the challenge from growing really quickly, from adding a lot of people to the team, is the fact that everyone does product differently. Like I'm fairly certain, and someone can tell me I'm completely wrong, but engineers at say Microsoft and Google are not incredibly different. Like their workflow, the tools they use, the way they deploy, like all that stuff feels fairly standardized because computer science has been around for some time. Whereas product management feels like everyone does it slightly differently. And so I think the challenge we had was with adding all these people really quickly was trying to figure out, how do we get everyone on the same page as fast as possible and get them to know kind of the Shopify version of product management? And so I think that was tricky. And then the other part that was tricky was we were, the team was at least doubling in size every year, if not more so early on. So it was, hey, the rituals, the practices, the techniques, the tool, everything we were using and was being set up for a team of a certain size was starting to break when we got to be, double the size, which means we were always trying to play catch up on, best practices, the way to do things, the way to think about things. And, I think it was okay. For me, I was always focused on making sure that the product was the best possible experience. If I had to choose one between like having a good product management discipline and having a good product, I'm going to choose having a good product.
And ultimately, to your point, we often had to just say, like, we know it's chaotic, right? But can we all agree that getting this feature out to merchants is the most important thing, just full stop? And I think like that was the thing that helped rally the team around and sort of battle harden people over the years to just accept that chaos and to recognize like underlying it, there is some trust. There's some organizational trust between each other and the fact that, we care about each other, but this is the reality of technology. Anything, if you had to do it all over again, almost exactly the same context, would you do anything differently with regards to how the product team formed and scaled?
It's hard to know because if you change one thing, who knows what the downstream effects. I mean, I'll just say broadly, one of my big concerns every year was, I know there's some things that we're doing that are standing in our way, and there's some things that we're doing that it's part of the magic of the company we are. And I didn't know which things I needed to change, and I didn't know which things to keep. And if you accidentally throw away the good stuff and you keep the bad stuff, like this company's, disappearing fast. So, as much as I would have loved for the environment to be less chaotic, like you said, there were some great products that came out of the chaos and the fact that we weren't, a perfectly well-oiled machine. And that was something that like I always struggled with, which is, from a pure like numbers and financial point of view, someone running the company should be able to like zoom in and say, okay, here's the, take the strategy at the top level and then zoom down all the way to like the every individual engineer or designer or product manager and say, okay, how exactly are they connecting all the way up, from that high level, vision, mission down to tactics, down to, like in theory, that's the absolute right way to do it. And if you optimize that to a perfect degree, you lose all creativity. And that was something I wanted to very much to make sure that we never got rid of. And there are products out there that are super well known and loved, Shop probably being one of the most well-known examples, that probably shouldn't have stood to that scrutiny because initially it was not connected with everything we were doing.
For those unaware, Shop is basically Shopify's consumer application. It started as a very humble package tracker where after Shopify order, you can get status updates on your shipment and it would kind of aggregate those across all the different businesses that you shop from. And today it's, one of the biggest consumer shopping apps in the world. So, something definitely that started as a big idea that could have went either way, but became something massive. Okay, last Shopify question, because there's some other things I want to ask you before we close. And it may be Shop, but the question is, across your entire arc, marketing and product, what are you most proud of at Shopify, of the work you did? One thing.
I mean, this sounds actually probably strange to say and to admit. I'd say it's just the people I worked with, and the fun we had and the challenges we went through. Again, it sounds bizarre. I remember at one point early on in my career, the assumption was I'm just going to be that guy that like sits in front of a computer all day that like never interacts with humans. Like I wasn't the stereotypical person you think would be managing or leading large teams. I was very much the individual contributor. And I think over time, I went from, hey, it was great when I built something to, hey, it was great when I told others to build something. And then I think I got to this point where I am in my life now where I actually love working with really smart people and seeing them succeed. And like nothing makes me happier than that. You know, I've done my thing. I'm very proud of everything I built and all the work we did. But now I'm just so proud to like work with others and see them and see what they're able to do. So I don't think there's one specific like Shopify thing.
That's great. Thank you, Craig. Great transition now. What are you doing now? What are you doing? It's been, it's been 6 months, I'd say, roughly, since you moved on from Shopify.
So I've been spending a lot more time with family, which is great. The usual thing is, as soon as you leave, you go and start something up again. And frankly, I kind of made this conscious decision that at least I'm done working for someone else. I'm not going to ever have another boss again in my life. And I feel pretty confident that that's the right decision. Again, I love working for Toby. But like, I think after him, like, I just don't think I want to work for someone. And I'm not quite sure I want to start my own thing right now. So for the past while, I have been helping a few companies out that like, I like the founder, I like the company, I like the vision. And I jokingly said this on Twitter a couple months ago where I said, hey, like instead of the next Shopify, I'm more interested in making 10 more. And frankly, I think it's because I really think the world needs more of these companies. And Canada can support more than one every decade. And so I think Shopify is going to be there for a long time. And I think there should be a whole bunch more that can add to it.
Yeah, taking from your Twitter, you kind of went public and said that you're really interested in companies that are in 3 areas. They're helping create and empower more entrepreneurs, similar to Shopify. Number 2, they're Canadian companies. And the third is they fight climate change. So I think everyone understands, why that's important to you and us all. What is your take on climate change?
So my last year at Shopify was 2020, during the onset of the pandemic. And I remember when it first really started hitting everyone that this was not a problem that was going to be, specific to just 1 or 2 areas in the world, that this was going to become a global problem. And we started shutting down offices and people started talking about this. I remember one night just like writing this kind of long stream of conscious document. And I didn't even know who I was writing it to or what the point of it was when I started. It was just like observations and extrapolations and thoughts as to like COVID and where things were going. And it ended up being, I think, 4 or 5 pages. And I eventually ended up sharing an edited version of that with the company. But the interesting thing about this, and the reason I mentioned this, and like it was not only, hey, here's what I think is happening, but it's here's how I think the company should respond to COVID. Because I also said, hey, I'd love for this to be a short-term thing, but I think this is actually going to drag on for a long time. Until everyone's vaccinated, which is going to take a long time, this is going to be a clear and present problem. But the original title for that document was actually WW COVID. And I wrote that because in my mind, I was kind of trying to draw the parallels between, World War I and what we were starting to see with COVID, in that it was a kind of global problem that required countries to do things they didn't normally do and to react in a big way and to mobilize. And I also, in the back of my mind, said, cool, eventually, like, this war might be over. But in the back of my mind, I thought, okay, well, then if this is World War I, what's World War II of this century? And in my mind, that's climate change. I think climate change, like, we already know it. We see it. Like, Texas is not supposed to have ice storms. California is not supposed to be on fire. Like, we already know it's there. It's just, we don't have the like political will and the stamina to actually do things about it. And I think people are starting to wake up to it more and more now. I actually think there's a big risk, by the way, now, as people say, finally, COVID's over. Let's all get on jet planes and fly around the world and like party and enjoy ourselves, to actually say, hey, maybe we should kind of curb some of those activities again, to just save humanity. But I do see this as being probably the defining challenge of our time. And I think everyone kind of would acknowledge it. I think few people probably have the ability to solve it. And I think the big problems are the ones that I'm after now. Like I'm literally signing myself up to fail.
Well, I, as a citizen of Earth, I'm happy you're putting your problem solving brain towards that. I think that's an amazing thing.
Thank you.
Well, I think this is a great place to wrap up. Craig, thank you for joining and sharing your story and insight with us. I'd love to ask you one final question before we go, and you can choose to provide as much or as little context to the answer as you want. And the question is, what's the single most important mental model or principle you have for life, work, or both?
I would say really understand the goal. I think people jump to tactics so quickly, and really focusing on like the why. I think there's someone much smarter than I did talked about like the 5 whys or something. Like there's some concept around that I don't quite know. But really think about problems deeply and understand what the goal of something is before you jump into doing that, because people love to just jump into tactics. And if you really understand the goal deeply, then it'll help with feedback loops. It'll help you find the quickest way there. It will allow you to do all these things that you really want to do. And I don't know if there's a term for this, but I would just say start with like really understanding what the goal is, what the why is behind things, and proceeding from there, not working backwards.
That's awesome. Thank you, Craig. And to everyone who's listening, we'll see you next time.